I would like to welcome all of you to this CCRI webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, good day to everybody. So as Vaisant already told you, this is actually a continuation to a previous CCRI webinar, which we actually had already almost 1 year ago. And there we raised that what are the current challenges in X-ray imaging dosimetry. This was quite special CCRI webinar because we actually had 7 speakers in this webinar, and we covered these like the stakeholder point of view, what are the challenges, and we had their speakers which were representing the regulatory body, the IAEA, and the international guidance, IEC standards, dosimetry manufacturers, medical physics perspective, radiation metrology and radiation metrologist point of view, and some research topics. And of course, all of these groups aim to have accurate and consistent measurements. All these presentations are available on the BIPM website and the YouTube channel, as already mentioned. So there you see the challenges, and today we aim to respond to some of these challenges. I just want to use this opportunity to mention that one of our speakers who was presenting in the previous webinar, Helen Corey, unfortunately passed away earlier this year, and I would like to share our deepest condolences to her family. But today, there are actually 2 big international projects behind the topics of today, and I want to just mention them briefly in the beginning. So one of them is the IAEA coordinated research project, where we aim to collect some data about the needs to update the current international code of practice, which is the IAEA TRS 457. In this project, we have been reviewing and testing the reference instruments, collecting data about capabilities of X-ray multi-MEMS, and there are also some topics about the CAP and CT measurements. And the aim of this project is to collect the data to update the TRS 457. There is another project which is called, it's a Euromed project, which is called TRAMEXI. It comes from Traceability in Medical X-ray Imaging Dosimetry. And this is a 3-year project where we aim to also provide support to this IAEA project. You can find all the details on our website, which is tramexi.com. The project has been running for 2 years, and it will be still continuing for 1 year. The main aims of this project is to really review the current radiation qualities which are used in clinical practice and compare them to the calibration radiation qualities and improve the situation there. Another challenge or a task is to understand the performance of different kind of dosimeters, ionization chambers, and X-ray multimeters, and use this data to provide some additional understanding about the uncertainties related to these measurements, and maybe also propose some more strict requirements for reference class equipment. And the third main aim is to harmonize this calibration and measurement procedures, and especially for the X-ray multimeters, the XMMs, for which we don't really have a good standardization, how to do the measurements and what are the definitions of these quantities. And all these, and especially the third one, should also support the IAEA CRP. There in this TRAMEXI project, we have 11 NMIs or DIs and 3 hospitals as beneficiaries. Then we have 3 collaborators. We have a quite extensive stakeholder committee representing IEC, IAEA, HERCA, and EFOMP. We have many dosimetry manufacturers included, some additional calibration laboratories, and medical physics associations. And the main aim is really to provide some data to update regulations and standards in this field. But you can find more information on our website. One example, what we have done under the project was the workshop which we organized together with Helsinki University Hospital last year in November, and there we really focused on that. We had a similar focus than we have today. So we had a workshop on X-ray imaging dosimetry, and actually this was 3 days workshop, and unfortunately we had some limit for the participation, and we could not accept all the participants who wanted to join this workshop. And that's one of the reasons why we have the CCRI webinar today. So we also want to share some of the main results what we already shared in this workshop, which was last year. You can find all those presentations from our website. So if you are interested in the topic, you can find those more information on our website. Then about the CCRI webinar of today, what are the main challenges what we covered today? There are several challenges, but these are the main challenges in focus today. So first of all, we have this gap between the reference and clinical radiation qualities. We want to cover that gap, and then we need to have traceability for the other quantities measured by the XMMs, not only the air kerma, but also tube voltage related quantities, HVLs, and so on. And the third challenge is the need for updated procedures, especially when we are using these XMMs. We don't have harmonized procedures for how to use them and how to define the quantities and how to have traceability for the other quantities. So we have 3 presentations after my introduction. We will start with Stefan Pojtinger, who is the head of the working group Dosimetry for Diagnostic Radiology at BTP. He's also the project leader of the 2 IEC standards focusing on the reference radiation qualities and the dosimeters, and he is involved in both projects mentioned before. He will give us, he will focus on challenge on gap between reference and clinical radiation qualities. And he will first introduce us to the technology of ionization chamber and X-ray multimeter, just to remind what are the differences in their energy dependence, and then compare the radiation qualities which are used in clinical practice to the ones which we're actually using in the calibrations. And then he will give the main result of the Tramexi project and what we are recommending, how we are recommending to update the new reference radiation qualities and how they should be used. The second presentation will be given by Miloš Živanović from Serbia. He's the head of the SSTL in Serbia. He has long experience and he is also involved in both projects. His challenge is to give guidance for the traceability for the other quantities measured by the XMMs. So first we need to define the quantities, and it's surprisingly challenging to actually give the good definitions for these quantities. So he will give a try for that. And then he will also give some information about the XMM performance for these quantities and introduce us what are our current plans to provide traceability and standardization for these quantities. And our third speaker is Olivera Bjelac from the IAEA. She's a medical physicist in the DMRP of the IAEA. And then she's also a clinical medical physicist, and her challenge today is to tell us about the need for update procedures. And this is also, of course, the aim of our CRP, where she is the leader of the CRP together with Sakitim Siman. Her task is to tell us a response, how to use these XMMs in clinical measurements, how to use the calibration certificates, and how to achieve the target uncertainties. So these are our 3 speakers of today, and we will start with Stefan Pojtinger. So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about our proposed update for reference radiation conditions. And therefore, we also consider solid-state detector-based X-ray multimeters. And I think it's a good start to talk about X-ray multimeters in general. In our project, what we understand as an X-ray multimeter would be your typical dosimeter you'd use in clinical practice if you are doing quality assurance on some X-ray machine. So this has not so many things in common with your typical electrometer ionization chamber combination. You might also know these are really up-to-date, comfortable devices. And what I think is the main reason why they are so common in clinical practice is that they are so easy to use. Basically, you take your detector unit, you put it on a patient support or whatever you have, you give one exposure, and you get an immediate display of the quantities of interest on the display. So you don't have a charge or a current you have to convert or something. You get a direct display, of course, of the air kerma rate. But also of some more advanced quantities like half-value layer, tube high voltage, and so on. And also the time resolution is quite high, so you can really see the pulses of your X-ray machine if you want to. The very fundamental challenge we have with that kind of devices is that all of them are built upon silicon diodes. And if you look at the energy dependence, or first at the mass energy absorption coefficients of silicon, you can see that in the energy range we are interested in diagnostic, there's a big change in that. So let's say between 10 and 150 keV, roughly, there's a lot of change in the energy absorption coefficients, and that translates to the response or the energy response of your detector. On top here, you can see an ionization chamber, and you can see in the energy range of interest, the energy response is more or less flat if you don't go too low. But for silicon diode, it's exactly that range, that area of the energy where you have a big change, a big dependence of the response of your silicon diode on the energy. And that's make it so challenging. What you now might ask yourself is, how can it be that these devices work so well? Because, well, you have this dependence here, but still they are showing the right value, you know, that if you use the device some kind. And the reason why it works is that all of the devices have implemented a more or less complicated algorithm to compensate for that energy dependence. And this slide is to give you a rough idea how it works. So in the actual detector unit of an XMMs, you don't have one silicon diode, you have multiple silicon diodes. And then the idea is, for example, here, this could be one silicon diode, this could be the other silicon diode. And then the idea is that you have different pre-filters inside of the detector unit. So each silicon diode will be filtered differently with different pre-filters. And then what you are going to do is you don't look at the signal of a single diode. You can, for example, look at the ratio of two diodes. And if you do that, because of the different filtrations of the diodes, you will get different results. And if you look at the ratio, you will see that this ratio, for example, will change, of course, on the filtration thickness, but also on the energy, based on the energy or the tube voltage at a real device. And that's a starting point. Now you can start to think about, I could calibrate that, for example, for tube voltage. Well, if I know the tube voltage, I have some idea about the spectrum, the photon spectrum of my X-ray device. And then with that information, I could calculate a correction for energy dependence, and then automatically correct my reading of the silicon diode for the air camera measurement based on that. And well, that's more or less what is done in modern devices. But of course, in the real device, all of this is much more complicated because you can use many, many diodes. You can use different filters here. And then there are many options for how you draft the algorithm to do all this. And that makes each of the devices really individual. So how many silicons, how many diodes were used, what kind of filtration was used, and what algorithm is used to do all of this correction for the energy dependence. If you want to calibrate or test, maybe in type testing, this kind of devices, you need X-ray reference conditions. In general, we have many reference conditions defined for X-rays. For example, in the ISO standard 4037, we have some for the purpose of radiological protection. Of course, we have the BIPM reference radiation conditions we are using for comparisons. Also, we have some national standards, for example, in Germany for absorbed dose to water in X-rays. But I think the most relevant standard for us today and for the project is IEC 61267, because this IEC standard explicitly defines reference X-ray radiation conditions for testing of medical diagnostic X-ray equipment. And that's what we want to do here. So at the start of the project, one question we were asking ourselves was, how representative are these X-ray radiation conditions we have currently standardized and that are written down in the standard? And we started with a large survey. So in the survey, we were asking manufacturers of different devices just to list their devices. So we covered several modalities. We covered mammography, we covered interventional, we covered dental, CT, and yes, that's what you see here, just a screenshot. And in addition to the names and the models of the devices, we were also asking for some basic information on the X-ray tube and also the filtration that is available at the devices. So for example, we were asking for the material of the anode of the X-ray tube. We were asking for the filtration. We were also asking for anode angles and KV range. And the reason we wanted to know the details for the devices was that if you have the knowledge about these quantities, you can calculate the HBL values for the energy range of each device. And that was the first good start for us. Here you can see some of the results. For example, here you can see this is the range of HBL values we found for mammography here, this range. And now you can start and compare it to the HBL range of the reference X-ray radiation conditions that are already described in the standard. And for example, for mammography, that would be here RQRM, RQAM, RQNM. That would be the standardized radiation conditions for mammography. And you can see that the HBL range in clinical practice is much broader. It's much higher HBLs involved. And of course, that is because of new anode filter combinations and techniques that are not really included in the standard already. Based on comparisons like this, we came up with several proposals we would like to give to IAC for an update for the next revision of the standard. And one thing we found was that there's a lack of reference X-ray radiation conditions that cover low or thin copper filters. So our first proposal to IAC will be that we would suggest to introduce reference radiation conditions for that. So really thin copper filters, for example, 0.1 millimeter of copper for a 50 kV X-ray tube. That is something we would recommend because this is not covered already by the international standard. If you look at how that plays out for a secondary standard ionization chamber, here I gave us an example, an extradine A3 ionization chamber that is often used. You can see that it makes a lot of sense to introduce these radiation conditions because here the calibration coefficients of this, so to say, very good detectors also change. So here you can see if you add 0.1 millimeter of copper and you look at the same HBL value, you get different calibration coefficients compared, for example, to the standardized RQR radiation series. And if this is clinical relevant, it makes a lot of sense to do calibrations for that kind of filtration. Also, in this figure, just on a side note, you can already see the good performance of an ionization chamber. Here, all of the different anode filter combinations over the whole HBL range, we are looking at the dependence of the response on energy changes by only around about 1%. The situation is much more complicated if we look at mammography. So what you can see here is a list from my colleague Elisabeth Salomon. And this is no comprehensive list. This is just some mammography devices. And as you can see here, there are many different combinations. So the first letter always shows you the material of the anode, and the second letter combination here shows you the material of the filter, and in between the thickness of the filter. And as you can see, there are different anode materials, there are different filter materials. And also if you stay with the same anode material and the same filter material, like here for tungsten, aluminum, you can see that there are different thicknesses of filter. So all of this is changing. And what we found when we were looking at all of the data in our list is that at least there's a most common combination. So we found that 5 of 8 manufacturers of mammography devices have the combination tungsten with 50 micrometers of rhodium. So our suggestion for IAC would be, of course, we cannot standardize all of the combinations, but maybe put the most common combination, and that from our perspective is tungsten rhodium, as you can see it here. In general, what we would also suggest in addition is to have one anode filter combination you can use to cover just the whole HBL range to do some kind of interpolation. But as you can see here, that can be challenging dependent on the uncertainty we are looking at. Because for So this is also a good secondary standard ionization chamber that you can use for mammography, the RC6M ionization chamber. And here you can really see that for different anode filter combinations, you have different calibration coefficients. And you can also see that it's a good introduction to have tungsten rhodium, because here you are really on the other side of the spectrum, so to say, compared to moly-moly. Moly-moly is currently the only standardized combination in the IEC standard. Again, overall, you can see that the ionization chamber in generally has a relatively flat energy dependence in that range. So everything here is between 0.1 and so 0 to 1% deviations between the calibration coefficients for that ionization chamber. Now, if we talk about XMMs, the situation is a little bit different. That's why I stressed it out for the ionization chamber so much. So the energy dependence of the response of an XMMs can be much larger than what we see for the very good ionization chambers. For example, here you can see calibration factors determined for ray-safe X2 XMMs. And here the calibration over RQR, where we have seen variations of less than 1% for the ionization chamber. And here for the XMM, you can see it's already 2%. And another thing that is really different is that the curve is not so nice looking like for the ionization chamber. For example, if I go back here for the extra-DIN-A3, you could kind of interpolate, for example, between RQR2 and 6 or so, and you would move closer to the calibration coefficient you actually want to have. But for some XMMs in some scenarios, that can be a horrible choice. For example, here for RQR, if you use RQR2 and RQR6 also for interpolation, you will make a huge mistake. And because this will always depend on the algorithm, the diodes, and the really individual detector, we don't recommend to do any interpolations of calibration factors for XMMs based on HVL. And also, we recommend to not use a calibration factor that has been determined for a specific combination or a specific series for another one. For example, here you can see between RQR and RQA, you have a difference of several percent if you use one calibration, if you want to use one calibration factor from one series for the other. The only thing that you can really say is if the XMM was tested against IEC 61674, which gives performance criteria for XMMs, there's a certain limit for the energy dependence. For example, if your XMM was tested for conventional beams in accordance with IEC 61674, then you can be sure that the energy dependence of the response will be less than 5% between RQR3 and 10, because this is a requirement put by the standard. So this is something you could ask in theory the manufacturer of the device. Was it tested and in which category? And then you have some knowledge about the energy dependence. An additional uncertainty or additional challenges if you're going to clinical beams. In this experiment we did at PDB, we compared calibration factors for XMMs. We determined at our calibration lab with calibration factors we determined at clinical beams. So what we did is we used all of the current models of the XMMs of all manufacturers, and we determined calibration factors in our laboratory. And that's what you can see here in black. Then in addition to that, for the same anode filter combination, we calibrated a good secondary standard ionization chamber, the RC6M ionization chamber. And then we moved with the XMMs and our secondary standard to clinics, to real clinical machines. And there we also determined the calibration factors of the XMMs. And as you can see here for air camera, for some devices, for example, for the Siemens Inspiration and also for one of the GE devices, we have a very good alignment of the calibration factors between clinic and laboratory. But that's not always the case. We also found some differences here, for example, for tungsten aluminum combination with the Piranha. And that's only for air camera. If you're going to look at other quantities that can be measured with XMMs like HVL, deviations can be larger, as you can see here on the right. So there are many different devices, and we tested a lot of them. And I think right now we are confident to say, because we tested so many devices and XMMs, that we can say the differences between the clinical beams and the laboratory beams when it comes to calibration and deviations of calibration factors, if you determine them in a laboratory condition and compare it to a clinical conditions, are somehow within 5%. One of the reasons we see why this calibration factors differ for the XMMs between laboratory conditions and clinical conditions is that the XMMs are technically blind for scatter radiation. Here we are talking only about mammography, and in a mammography we were putting the pedal of the mammography device on the RC6M ionization chamber because we wanted to measure the radiation that is also seen later by the patient. And of course, ionization chamber, especially the RC6M with a thin entrance filter, will see that scattered radiation. But most of the XMMs won't see that scattered radiation. For example, the RTI perennia, on top of the diodes, it has a very tight collimation that will just remove all of the scattered radiation. So of course, your ionization chamber will see that. Your XMMs will not see that, and under laboratory conditions, of course, we calibrate without scatter, because if you want to establish a reference radiation field, which pedal are you going to use? So there's no standard for that, and we think that's a lot where the difference is coming from between the laboratory calibration factors and the clinical calibration factors. And this already, what I also wanted to mention is that some manufacturers, for example, RTI perennia, in their manual, you will find a correction for that. They will tell you if you want to compare to an ionization chamber and you need to include a scatter, you can just multiply a factor of, I'm not 100% sure, I think it's around 6%. So this is a tabulated value for that specific device. But of course, that cannot work for all mammography devices under existence because your scatter radiations will always be a little bit different depending on the device and the pedal and so you are looking at. So if you really want to measure the scattered radiation, you have to think a little bit more about it if you want to do it with, let's say, low uncertainties. This brings me to my conclusions. So what I've showed you today is that we are going to propose new reference radiation conditions. You saw the new copper radiation conditions for conventional and also our idea for mammography. You've seen that the calibration coefficients for well-selected ionization chambers that are typically used as secondary standards vary by less than 1% for typical conventional mammography beam. I've also showed that when an XMM was tested against IEC 61674, the response independence of energy changes by only plus minus 5% for given rated range. You have to be sure that you stay within the rated range. For example, RQR for conventional beams. Also showed calibration factors for XMMs. If you determine these at clinical beams and compare that to calibration factors that you determined at laboratory conditions can differ by up to 5%. And that's also something to consider. And this is my last slide. And therefore I say thanks for listening and back to Paula.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. This was an excellent presentation. We take the questions in the end, so we go directly to Miloš, to our second presentation, and he will continue with this XMM measurement quantities and give us guidance on this field. Miloš, the floor is yours.
So the second presentation is about the definition of XMM measurement quantities. And first I want to mention that this is based on a similar presentation that me and Markus Borowski gave on Tramexi workshop in Helsinki. So I adapted that presentation for the CCRI webinar. So my name is Miloš Živanović. I'm from Vinča Institute, Serbia. So I'm going to skip the general introduction and go right to the topic. So you know that when you're doing quality control in diagnostic radiology, that you usually want to measure several quantities, so some other quantities besides air kerma. So 20, 30, 50 years ago, if you wanted to measure multiple quantities, you would need first ionization chamber and electrometer to measure air kerma. Then if you had aluminum filters, you can use them to measure and calculate half value layer. You could also use a voltage divider to measure tube voltage, and then you could use lookup tables to estimate total filtration, etc., etc. So it was a very complicated procedure with a lot of expensive equipment, and a lot of expertise was needed. But now, luckily, we have X-ray multimeters, which you can usually just put on a tabletop, and some of them are even triggered by radiation. So you can just do a short exposure, and you can get all these quantities and some other quantities besides practically in several seconds. So they're not really cheap. They can cost several €1,000. But if you look at all the equipment that you previously needed, it is probably an order of magnitude lower price. So it is all well and nice and fantastic. You get many different quantities and a lot of data in a very short time. So there are many quantities. Some of them you can measure only invasively, some of them only non-invasively. So here in this presentation, we are interested only in quantities that can be measured dosimetrically by an X-ray multimeter. So here we use the definition XMM measurement quantities. So as I said, you can get many different measured values in several seconds. But as you know, measurement is not complete without measurement uncertainty. And then when you start thinking about measurement uncertainty, we get to some problems here. So in order to estimate measurement uncertainty, maybe you will wonder if there is some type testing data, or what are the standard requirements for the measurement of different quantities. And you will find that for several quantities, there are actually no standard requirements and no IEC standards or other standards. And then also you will probably wonder how other influence quantities influence your measurements. For example, how does the ambient temperature influence HVL measurements or time measurements or whatever? And again, because there are no IEC standards with requirements for measuring devices, you will also probably not be able to find how do different influences influence your measurement. And then also you need calibration factor and associated uncertainty, first to make sure that you have traceability, and then also to estimate your measurement uncertainty. And again, for many quantities, there are almost no calibration laboratories anywhere in the world. For example, for total filtration, very few. Well, you can probably get some tests, but not real calibrations. And again, there is a problem here. And finally, the most basic question, what is the definition of these quantities? If you try to find this out, for some quantities, you will find different answers that are actually mutually exclusive. And also some measuring devices from different manufacturers use different principles and different definitions for measuring different quantities. So all of these facts complicate measurements to a huge extent. And if you're looking at air kerma, as Stefan showed us in the previous presentation, there are multiple standards and definitions and traceability and primary standards, and everything is very well defined. But if you look at different quantities, there are smaller or larger gaps. And in Tramexi project, we decided to look into this first to see what are the gaps, and then to try to bridge some of these gaps. And this is still work in progress, so I'm just going to show you what we've done so far. So just shortly in the beginning, we were actually interested if all of these quantities are actually used in clinical practice, if they're necessary. Because if something is not used, you do not need to put effort to standardize it and to provide traceability. So I was a little bit surprised to see that almost all of these quantities listed in this table are used by majority of medical physicists in general radiology. So majority of them use exposure time, HVL, tube voltage, total filtration measurements, etc. And if you look at mammography applications, again, there are multiple quantities besides air karma that are commonly used and that therefore needs standardization and traceability and all the attention that metrological community can give them. So we decided to look more into these quantities, and I'm just going to give you a short overview now of different quantities related to quality control in diagnostic radiology. So first, I'll speak a little bit about tube voltage. And here on the right side, you can see a graph from TRS 457. And the graphs represent different waveforms for tube voltage. And you can see, so this is a general case. Tube voltage can have different dependence on time. And the variations in tube voltage can be smaller or larger. And ideally, we of course want to use only one number to represent tube voltage, but tube voltage is a function of time. So in order to use only one number, we can define different quantities. For example, we can define average voltage, just calculate the average value over time. We can look at the peak voltage, so maximum peak voltage, which is the maximum value during an exposure, or we can look at different peaks and then calculate the average peak value. So there are different quantities, they have different values. And there is also a problem, for example, if you use average voltage, there is a problem of when do you start measuring and when do you stop measuring. So do you start at the beginning of exposure when the voltage is 0, or do you wait for the voltage to stabilize, or do you start measuring halfway for the voltage increase? So some definitions are not very clear. And the problem is increased because for most of these quantities, there are no standards that give definitions for them. So the advantages for tube voltage measurements compared to other quantities are that there are primary standards that are widely available. So usually high voltage dividers are used. You can measure voltage over time, and you can calculate any of these quantities with very low uncertainty if you only have harmonized definition. Traceability is also available for different tube voltage values, and also if you have non-invasive measurement device, you can calibrate it for many different radiation qualities. So this is also good. There is also a clear idea about measurement uncertainty, provided that you have harmonized definition. And there is IC standard for one of these quantities for practical peak voltage. On the other hand, there are many different quantities that are in use in parallel. And in many cases, it is not clear which of the quantities is indicated by an XMM. And in our surveys, we saw that many users are not really clear which quantities they are measuring and which quantities they need. So there is a little bit of ambiguity about this. Also, not all definitions are clear for all quantities. There is only standard for one quantity and the others are not standardized. But on the other hand, many modern machines have almost constant potential. So if there is constant potential, then all the tube voltage related quantities are equal. So in that case, it is not really important which of them you measure and how you define them. But of course, in metrology, we want to have clear definitions. So the first quantity is practical peak voltage. It is very important for calibration laboratories because it is standardized. So IEC 61267 uses practical peak voltage, and there is also definition in IEC 61676. And you can find standard requirements for non-invasive devices measuring practical peak voltage. also radiation qualities that are used for calibration of user equipment use practical peak voltage. So this quantity is very commonly used in calibration laboratories, but our surveys show that the end users, the clinical medical physicists, very rarely use this quantity. So this is a downside. So another advantage is that there is a very clear definition in the standard. There is also clearly defined voltage cutoff, because you can see the formula here for calculation of practical peak voltage. So there are weighting factors that are used, and below 20 kilovolts, these weighting factors are 0. So you know when you should start the measurement, when you should stop the measurement. It is all clear. And the disadvantage is that only a few XMMs can show you this quantity. So even if you want to measure it, it is highly likely that your XMM cannot actually measure it, that it doesn't provide you the value for this quantity. So the next quantity that I will mention is maximum peak voltage. So definition is relatively clear. So you take the maximum value of voltage during a single exposure, and this is your maximum peak voltage, or KVP. So the definition in the standard is actually a maximum value during a specified time interval. So the only problem here is how you define the time interval. And the ambiguity can be related to rush current effects, because for some X-ray machines, you can have first peak that is much larger than the following peaks. And now it depends whether you are interested in this peak and how representative it is of the overall radiation quality and of the dose that the patient will receive. So if you want to exclude it, then of course you will get different value than if you include also the first peak. There is another problem that there is no IC standard for devices that measure KVP. So then, of course, there are also no limits of variations and other data that we would get from a standard. And then the next quantity is exposure time. So here, again, we do not have a standard for non-invasive measurement of exposure time. And there is no central standard where you would find a harmonized definition for this quantity. So you have to look at different standards that tell you how to do quality control for different diagnostic machines. And for example, if you look at IC 60601-2-54, there you can find a definition that exposure time is the time between the first and last transition for the 50% level of the maximum air karma rate. And this definition is nice, and we had some discussions in the project, and probably we will suggest this as a harmonized definition. But it is possible to define exposure time in different way. For example, if you use different level, 75% level, or if you look at tube voltage instead of air karma rate. So we need to make sure that everybody is using the same definition before we can standardize this quantity, before we can provide really harmonized standardized calibrations, and before we can compare the measurements. And here in these graphs, you can see, for example, that on the second graph, exposure time is actually 18 milliseconds, because this whole part of the exposure, when the dose rate is rapidly decreasing, is excluded from the calculation. So we need time resolved data to be able to determine exposure time. So as I said, if you look at different standards, for example, standard for air karma measurements, for PPV measurements, or standard for that defines reference radiation qualities, none of them give definition of exposure time. And also there is no separate IC standard that gives requirements for non-invasive measurement of exposure time. Because of this, it is not easy to calculate measurement uncertainty for clinical measurements. So maybe you have calibration certificate and you have uncertainty of the calibration factor. But of course, there are other influences that can increase measurement uncertainty. So also, if you want to get traceability for exposure time, it is very likely that your local calibration laboratory will not be able to provide calibration. Usually manufacturers can do it, and very few secondary standard dosimetry laboratories, but most of them cannot provide calibrations. So this is also something that should be solved in the future. The next quantity is half value layer. So you know that you can use some detector that has low energy dependence, such as ionization chamber. And then you can measure air kerma without any filters, and then you can just keep adding aluminum filters until air kerma drops to 50% of the initial value. And in that way, you can measure half value layer. But of course, this procedure is complicated and takes a long time, which is usually not available in clinics. XMMs can use, they use several detectors that they have behind different filters to calculate HVL from one single exposure. And here I want to mention that you shouldn't use XMM with aluminum filters to calculate XMM, because indications of XMMs are very, very dependent on radiation quality. And of course, if you add aluminum filters, you are changing radiation quality. Beam hardening is happening. So in that case, you can get very, very wrong result. And again, if you look at IC 61674 and IC 61676, there is no definition for half value layer. There is only a simple definition in IC 61267. It says that HVL is thickness of a specified material which reduces the air kerma rate to half of the initial value. And this specified material in diagnostic radiology is usually aluminum. So we usually specify HVL in millimeters aluminum. There's also another, so in order to have harmonized definition, we need to decide if we are using the whole exposure for HVL measurement. So for time, I said that we are starting only when air kerma rate first reaches 50% of the maximum value. Here for HVL measurements, we recommend that the whole exposure is used. And of course, if you're using, for example, ionization chambers, you will have to use the whole exposure. So you usually don't have possibility to remove the first part of the exposure. There are also several standards that give measurement procedures for HVL measurements, such as ISO 4037 or IAEA TRS 457. And these procedures can be used to establish harmonized calibration procedures in the future. But at this moment, there is no IC standard that gives requirements for non-invasive HVL measurement device or limits of variation. There is also currently no published harmonized calibration procedure. And we did a survey amongst calibration laboratories, and we found that most of them do not estimate uncertainty at this moment. So of course, before starting a calibration service, we will need good, clear guidance how to estimate measurement uncertainty. And finally, total filtration. So this is the least well-defined quantity and the least standardized. Because first, of course, there is no primary standard for total filtration. there is currently no traceability. It is not possible to establish traceability for non-invasive total filtration measurements. And also, you know that there are many different materials between the focus of the X-ray tube and the detector or the patient. So there is tube window, there are different filters, there is air, there is probably some cooling liquid. And again, you want to express total filtration as one number, so you cannot put thicknesses of all these different materials. So you're usually expressing it as quality equivalent filtration. And then you need to decide on the material in terms of which you want to express it. Usually it is aluminum, of course, similar as HVL. And the problem is that aluminum equivalent filtration is dependent on radiation quality. So you need to decide for which energy or which tube voltage you want to express it, and which material, etc. So definition is not clear. And also the way that you standardize measurements and calibrations is not clear. So total filtration consists of inherent filtration that is present in the tube and cannot be removed, and also additional filtration that is usually added to remove low energy part of the spectrum. And there is currently IC standard that gives a method for determination of permanent filtration. And usually if you know added filtration in terms of millimeters aluminum, and then you measure permanent filtration, you can also calculate total filtration. So there is this standard that can be used as a starting point to standardize total filtration measurements. And also, for example, in ISO 4037, there is a lookup table for 60 kilovolts that you can use to calculate total filtration if you know the tube voltage, 60 kilowatts, and if you measure HVL. So there are different lookup tables that can be used for these purposes. But here, there is still a lot of work to be done before we can start providing calibrations for total filtration. And this is the summary. Can XMMs be used to measure all these XMM quantities? They can, but estimating uncertainty is still a big problem for many of the quantities. Providing traceability is still a big problem. Before we can get reliable and accurate measurements for all quantities, we need first to write standards for all these quantities, and then we need to provide traceability. We did some initial tests in the Tramexi project, and some publications will be forthcoming maybe this year or the next year. So if you want to keep following the results, you can go to Tramexi.com, where you can find all the news and all the new publications. So what I can tell you is that the initial results look good. So for most quantities and for most radiation qualities, the results are relatively good. But the problem is that our evaluation is not on a very high level for all quantities, because we do not have standards, because traceability is still questionable for some of the quantities, and because measurement uncertainty estimate is still not it is still not good enough for all quantities, in my opinion. But we are working on this. We still have 1 year in Tramexi project, and I hope that in the next webinar I will be able to present more and better results. Okay, so this is all that I wanted to say.
Thanks a lot, Miloš, for this very comprehensive presentation. I would also like to use the opportunity to mention that we are actually working very closely together with the dosimetry manufacturers, which have been very supportive for the project. And at the moment, we have a small team working group where we are discussing about these quantities and these definitions, and we are aiming, as Miloš already told us, we are aiming to also write one publication on this topic to really define these quantities together. And I think it's a unique opportunity. So it's not only the company itself defining how they do the things, but we are actually bringing these companies together so that we can have harmonized procedures for these quantities. Okay, then I suggest we proceed to our last speaker of today, Olivera Ciraj Bjelac, and she will give us the IAEA perspective and what we should do with and how we should update the procedures, how we do the measurements. So, Olivera, it's your turn.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Vincent, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be part of this webinar again after a year. I'm coming from International Atomic Energy Agency, and I'm imaging medical physicist. And as most of you know, the agency has a global and synergic role in dosimetry by supporting its member states in building the dosimetry and medical physics capacities. Dosimetry and medical radiation physics section is in fact responsible for this part of the agency mandate, and we support our member states by providing calibration and auditing services to the member states by developing radiation dosimetry protocols and coordinating network of secondary standard dosimetry laboratories together with the World Health Organization. And we also provide a lot of support to the clinical medical physicists in different areas of their work, including dosimetry. So through these three projects, we in fact support our member states to implement radiation in imaging and radiotherapy through optimized dosimetry and the good medical physics practice. So if we go back to dosimetry in diagnostic radiology, this codes of practice that was published back in 2007 has been mentioned already several times, but at the time when it was published, it provided so necessary harmonization and standardization of dosimetry in diagnostic radiology through defining radiation conditions and relevant applications, specific dosimetry quantities at that time aligned with ICRU 74, and the document also provided guidelines to calibration laboratories and hospitals. As Paula mentioned at the very beginning, we are currently collecting data for the update of the codes of practice, having in mind technological development in X-ray imaging modalities and also in dosimetry and other measurements instruments. So in this talk, next 15 minutes, I will try to go through the dosimeters that are incorporated in the X-ray multimeters in clinical measurements, touch a little bit use of calibration certificates to assess and achieve target uncertainties in the clinical environment. This is very hefty task that Paula gave to me, and I doubt that we'll have answers to all the questions that will be raised, but at least I hope that it will put some different perspective from the clinical point of view to the certain uncertainty, to the measurement uncertainty so important to make certain decisions in clinical environment. So we all know that X-ray imaging modalities are extremely diverse and that the main product of imaging is image. So we look to the image quality and to its collateral damage, which is radiation dose. These procedures are not standardized compared to laboratory procedures, and amount of radiation that is used to create an image depends heavily on the procedure complexity, patient characteristics, and disease severity. And all these elements and facts also hinder the accuracy of dosimetry in diagnostic radiology. Still, the dosimetry is very important in X-ray images for a number of different reasons, starting from performance testing of imaging equipment, for example, quality control test, for optimization of procedures through assessment on the local skin dose or establishing and use of diagnostic reference levels. We use dosimetry to validate display dose indices, for example, KERMA area product values or dose indices provided in the radiation dose structure report. We also use dosimetry as patient generic dosimetry to make certain decisions, whether certain modality is preferred over the other, or to assess appropriateness of medical imaging. And sometimes we also use dosimetry to assess individual patient risk, which is mainly obtained through the organ dose assessment. All these different applications, of course, have different impact on uncertainty requirements that broadly ranges from 5 to 7%. For example, if we use air camera measurements as part of performance testing of X-ray units, through 30 to 50%, which is typical uncertainty of organ dose assessments, up to 75 or even 100% if we are aiming at collective effective dose assessment. Who is responsible for all these activities? Of course, medical physicists. And in the last webinar, this was my task to present dosimetry from the medical physics perspective. But if you look to the relevant agency documents and standards, for example, basic safety standards of GSR Part 3, medical physicist is clearly responsible for calibration, both of medical radiological equipment, of X-ray units, and dosimetry instrumentation. Medical physicist is responsible for quality assurance and dosimetry of patients. When we speak about dosimetry quantities in diagnostic radiology, it's relatively easy because the basic quantity is kerma in air that is directly measurable, and it is basis for the number of so-called application-specific dosimetry quantities that are specific to different X-ray imaging modalities. These quantities are further used to assess organ dose and risk assessment. And as you can see on these slides, different application-specific quantities are used in different imaging modalities, starting from general radiography, fluoroscopy, mammography, to assess amount or measure amount of radiation use in certain imaging procedure. All these quantities are directly measurable. These quantities are used for organ dose assessment as normalization quantities, and the point that I would like to make here is that accuracy of air camera is extremely important because it affects the accuracy of all other activities that come afterwards. For the measurable quantities in diagnostic radiology, we use different instruments that were extensively covered in the previous two talks. And both Miloš and Stefan mentioned different instruments that are aimed for those measurements, mainly in terms of air camera, also for tube voltage assessment and measurement of other parameters like exposure time or tube current exposure time product, total filtration, half-wave layer, and so forth. But in the last 20 years, all these parameters and quantities are somehow combined in one instrument that we call X-ray multimeter. Compared to ionizing chambers that are considered to be a golden standard in dosimetry in diagnostic radiology, multimeters are based on semiconductor detectors that have, as already discussed, more pronounced energy dependence that is compensated by different methods introduced by manufacturers. They are also sensitive to the position within the X-ray field, for example, due to Hill effect, and they have backscatter protection, so they are blind to the scatter radiation, which are the facts that differs them compared to the ionizing chambers. Accuracy of dosimetry measurements is provided through the unbroken chain of traceability chain, starting from the primary dosimetry laboratories to secondary laboratories to hospitals. And the main proof of the traceability and dosimetry accuracy is calibration certificate. Calibration certificate is in fact a product of calibration, and it's by standard, mainly ISO IEC 17025 standard, contains certain mandatory elements that are related to the equipment, to be calibrated, user details, short description of calibration procedures and conditions used during the calibration. The main product of the calibration is calibration coefficient, and it should be presented in quantity and unit along with appropriate uncertainty, associated uncertainty of calibration. Another mandatory part of calibration certificate is information on the reference standards and traceability. In many instances, this additional information comes as an appendix, and in this slide you can see an example of the appendix to the calibration in the IAEA laboratory for diagnostic radiology calibrations, along with example of uncertainty budget, and this is really available from the agency website. Traceability information or calibration coefficients is the first parameter or influencing quantity that contributes to the uncertainty budget of the measurements. Other parameters that contribute to the overall uncertainty are related to the use physical constants, then conditions during the measurements, used measurement protocol and measurement setup, as well as the properties of the instrumentation or dosimeters used during the measurements. I would like to emphasize that the measurements conditions or environmental conditions in hospitals are quite different compared to calibration laboratories. In calibration laboratories, the environmental conditions are strictly controlled in terms of temperature, pressure, and humidity. The setup is reproducible and fixed. The procedures are standardized, in most instances outlined in the standards and protocols. The sources of uncertainty are well known and relatively well controlled. And in most cases, I hope that colleagues from calibration laboratories would agree, there is absence of time pressure compared to hospitals. As opposed to laboratories, hospitals are the dynamic environment with relatively unstable environmental conditions. It's sometimes enough that someone opened the window and we have a flash of hot air or humidity. Diverse setup configurations are used, very often not in the reproducible manner, which implies that sources of uncertainty are not well controlled and known. We have diversity of radiation qualities. This was also discussed in the previous talks, especially by Stefan, and we normally have a time pressure of patients coming for examinations and very limited time to perform the measurements. And all these facts, in fact, have an impact on the accuracy of measurements in hospitals. But we know when we discuss the uncertainties and accuracy that all measurements are wrong to a certain extent, and what we perceive as an error is in fact a discrepancy between measured value and something that is considered a true value. Of course, true value is not known, and by virtue of that, the error is not known, which is why we use uncertainty and try to assess uncertainty in order to have a rough estimate how large the error might be. So towards uncertainty budget, we need certain steps in order to have the final result. And the first step is called model equation, which is description of relationship between input and output of the measurements. Through this process, we need to identify the influencing parameters and standard uncertainties contributing to the uncertainty budget, followed by the calculation of the combined standard uncertainties, usually expressed as expanded measurement uncertainty presented in the certain manner, in most instances as a rounded results to one or two significant digits. This is that most of the physicists would know very well, but let's go back to the model equation. In the case of dosimetry, is in principle dosimetry formalism, as this example that you can see on this slide related to air kerma, which is a product of the meter reading or measurement results corrected for calibration coefficients and number of correction factors related to the radiation quality, environmental conditions, and other influencing quantities related to the properties of the setup and instrument itself. The standard uncertainties, again, this is something that we know very well, just to remind ourselves, can be classified as type A and B. Uncertainties of type A are mainly associated with repeated measurements and are basically standard deviation attributed to the normal distribution, whereas the type B uncertainty are estimated by any other methods than statistics, which means that we have only one measurement. In the most instances, we use statistical distribution, either uniform or triangular, to assess the uncertainty type B. In the case of non-correlated uncertainties, these two types of uncertainties can be combined as square root of quadratic sum to present the total uncertainty of type C. In most cases, we will attribute Gaussian probability density to the total uncertainty and use confidence limits or coverage factors for the different uncertainty types. If we talk about X-ray multimeters, we heard already today that they are used to measure different physical quantities and different parameters, or for calculation of different parameters. Air kerma and air kerma rates are just examples of quantities provided by multimeter from the one exposure. There are other parameters that are very relevant to the medical physics practice. Properties of the X-ray multimeters as dosimeters are defined by the IEC standard 61674. And if you look to the table 5 of these standards, you will see that for the range of standard radiation qualities, the uncertainty of these dosimeters should be within the 5%, which is the case in the almost for all multimeters as presented earlier by Stefan. This standard also provides an example of combined standard uncertainty for dosimeter performance of multimeter, and it's quite useful because it identifies possible performance characteristics that might affect the uncertainty of measurements. And in this example of the hypothetical dosimeter, the combined standard uncertainty of a clinical dosimetry measurements is approximately 6.6%. But if we go back to the procedure itself, the traceability comes through calibration process and brings up the calibration certificate. And this is one input parameter for the measurements in hospitals that is again influenced by number of parameters related to the setup, environmental conditions, and properties of dosimeters used in clinical environment. And all these parameters can be classified either as uncertainties type A or uncertainties type B, and they eventually contribute to the overall uncertainty budget of the dosimetry measurements in hospital. And if we start from the beginning, the calibration coefficient that is essential part of the calibration certificate always comes with a certain uncertainty. Each instrument should come with calibration uncertainty. If not, the calibration should be requested from the secondary standard dosimetry laboratory. And if you look to the certain elements of the calibration certificate, you will be able to identify the radiation quality, error or calibration factor, as well as uncertainty of the calibration factor. All these parameters are contributing to the overall uncertainty budget. There are two options when using the calibration certificate. One is to apply correction factor or to the measurement results and use uncertainty of the calibration factor. The other option is to combine these two and increase overall uncertainty budget due to difference in radiation qualities. Radiation quality is quite big and important consideration when we talk about solid state detectors or dosimeters due to very pronounced energy dependence. This was already discussed by Stefan earlier today. So calibration factors are provided by secondary standard dosimetry laboratories for the certain standard radiation qualities. However, in clinical conditions, these dosimeters or detectors are used in the range of different radiation qualities that are quite different compared to the standard radiation qualities. And solution, most likely, and Stefan confirmed this today, the dosimeters would perform better than 5% uncertainty. However, if we want to improve the accuracy of measurements, we might look for interpolation of calibration factors. For the dosimeters that have smooth energy dependence, this should be quite feasible or doable. However, for dosimeters like XMMs that have quite unpredictable energy dependence, the interpolation error might be high, and the interpolation would not be the method to be used. So the best way to increase accuracy of measurements or reduce uncertainty would be to correct the measurements results to the closest possible radiation qualities used, and to use uncertainty of calibration factor in the uncertainty budget. And as you can see on this example, the relative expanded uncertainty of calibration is 0.7 or 0.8% for the range of standard radiation qualities. However, the calibration factors are quite different. So if we apply separately all these calibration factors for different radiation qualities, we would be able to reduce uncertainty of measurements by 3% and keep only component attributed to the uncertainty of the calibration factors. Otherwise, the uncertainty would be 4 or 5%. Camera rate is also another parameter to be considered as contributor to the overall uncertainty budget. And there are different sources that can be used to assess the camera rate. In principle, according to the IC standards, the uncertainty would be approximately 1%. From measurements published in the peer-review literature, the uncertainty attributed to the camera rate should be less than 4%, but according to the few published papers that were looking in this property, this uncertainty in reality is even less and almost negligible. Another important component or aspect that should be considered when using the X-ray multimeters is their orientation and direction of the radiation incidence. These instruments are basically designed to be used in the perpendicular geometry. So basically they would have correct readout only in the X-ray beam axis is normal to the entrance surface of dosimeters. According to the recent paper, the correctness of indication of radiation dose with XMMs would be okay for the angles plus minus 15 degrees. However, depending on the design of the XMM, this angular dependence might be different and more pronounced for the robust instruments than compared to the small ones. As they contain a row of different semiconductor detectors covered with different layers of copper filtration, the orientation within the X-ray beam is also important parameters, as the instruments can be affected by the Hill effect. So as a rule of thumb, the orientation should always be perpendicular to the anode cathode axis, and this orientation is very, very important in mammography, even more in diagnostic radiology, of course. For the smaller field sizes and better collimation, this effect is less pronounced. Other influencing quantities that should be considered and evaluated are pressure, temperature, and humidity, which is almost negligible in the case of semiconductor-based detectors, as well as electromagnetic compatibility and operating voltage, provided that the battery is full. So to summarize this walk through the different components of the uncertainty budget, we as medical physicists have in our hand some of the components of the uncertainty budget that can be controlled from some local measurements, our experience from the literature, and that can contribute that our air kerma measurements are more accurate than average in clinical conditions. And on these slides, you can see one example of uncertainty budget of the air kerma in radiography from the Agency Code of Practice for Dosimetry in Diagnostic Radiology, and two examples that were used in the previous slides, depending how well we control radiation quality and energy dependent of the dosimeters and dependence of the kerma rate, and for example, field size and homogeneity, the uncertainty of the air kerma measurements, expanded uncertainty can be reduced from 14% to almost 5%. Miloš mentioned that multimeters, and this is something that as clinical medical physicist I know very well, are extensively used by medical physicists in hospitals. Hardly anyone uses ionizing chambers anymore. So these instruments are also core instruments for the quality assurance and quality control programs implemented in the hospitals. And just one example of the protocol that is widely used internationally is the agency handbook of basic quality control tests for diagnostic radiology, which is essentially a compilation of the essential QC tests across diverse imaging modalities. And without going into details, I would like just to bring to your attention to the three parameters that are part of the quality control protocols and that are based on the use of X-ray multimeters. One is tube potential accuracy that is based on measurement of the X-ray tube voltage using X-ray multimeters. The code of practice or handbook describes the procedure for the measurements of the tube voltage and provides information about baselines and tolerances by stating that deviation from the measured kilovoltage values from the nominal one should be within the 5%, which means that in this case we use the multimeter to make certain decision and to provide certain compliance statement. But of course, measurement with multimeters come with certain uncertainty, and in this case, we would need to apply certain decision rule. In the upper right part of this slide, you see the set of measurements with uncertainties, and the green one are those that are certainly passing. The red one is the one that certainly fails. However, we have this yellow set that is not conclusive and highly depends on the measurement uncertainty. We, in fact, don't know how to assess uncertainty of the tube voltage measurements in the clinical condition, apart from the uncertainty that comes from calibration certificates of multimeter manufacturers that is in most cases better than 2%. Most of the manufacturers would also state compliance with IC 61676 and practical peak voltage, though we have seen from the Miloš presentation that practical peak voltage is not extensively used in the clinical community. Similarly to tube voltage, exposure time is parameter that is part of the quality control test. And we also learned from Miloš that there is no standard convention how to define exposure time based on Kerma profile. In most cases, it would be the distance between 50% of the waveform peak. However, some manufacturers would use different convention and go for 10 or 75%. In most of the manufacturer specification, the accuracy of exposure time measurements would be better than 1%. But again, as clinical medical physicists, we have to provide compliance statement that exposure time is better than 10 or 15% compared to the nominal one. And again, this compliance statement should be based on the measurements that are associated with a certain uncertainty that needs to be assessed. And finally, about half-value layer and total filtration. I'm not quite sure that half-value layer should be considered as a physical quantity because it's not directly measured. It's rather calculated based on the air Kerma measurements and thickness of aluminum, which means that HVL heavily depends on radiation quality and accuracy of the air Kerma measurements, and pretty much the same applies to the total filtration. These two parameters are quite important because they're also input parameters for calculation of other physical quantities, for example, radiation output or mean glandular dose in mammography, which is why we need the harmonized definitions and well-defined test conditions to assess uncertainty associated with assessment of the HVL in clinical conditions. And just for your information, the Handbook of Basic Quality Control Test also states that HVL measurement is one of the mandatory QC parameters and allows for use of two methods. One is based on the ionizing chamber and aluminum filters, and the other one that is, I would say, mainly used in clinical environment is based on the use of XMMs to measure half-value layer, again, for the same reason that I mentioned in the case of the tube voltage and exposure time. Uncertainty of the HVL is very important in the clinical conditions for the sake of the compliance statements that medical physicists have to make. And to summarize what I have so far, I would like to emphasize that uncertainty is rarely topic in clinical medical physics community in diagnostic radiology, but it's essential for reliable dosimetry and quality assurance. Sometimes even the dosimetry formalism is not well understood. That has implications on what I said before. It's also very important for us, clinical medical physicists, to know properties of XMMs from the perspective of their energy dependence and the compensations or corrections applied by manufacturers. It's also important to know algorithms behind assessment of other quantities and parameters, for example, HVL. For medical physicists, it's important to understand the calibration certificate, and I have to say that from the agency perspective, we are receiving more and more requests from member states for training on the uncertainty assessment. And when using calibration certificate, the good way is to compare measurement conditions and calibration conditions in the lab, and in this way use calibration coefficients and uncertainties associated with calibration coefficients provided by the secondary standard dosimetry laboratories. In order to compensate or correct for energy dependence and different radiation qualities, it's always good to request calibration that covers entire range of clinical use, because this could be one of the ways to decrease uncertainty of the measurements, and of course to use available resources and learn from others and from the published data. And on the final slide you can see a collection of good resources for starting creating uncertainty budget in the clinical measurements in diagnostic radiology. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olivera. I think it was very encouraging that you say that this is in our hands. So I'm also a medical physicist. So basically, medical physicists, if they understand how to use this equipment, they can also impact and decrease the uncertainties if we know what we're doing and if we have the data available.